So my name is Allen Lim. I'm an exercise physiologist by training. I'm also the founder of Scratch Labs. Um, I have kind of a weird life in that I spent most of my career training pro cyclists, and it's kind of all I ever wanted to do. But around 2010, I kind of gave it up, started this new company, but made this general rule, and the rule was that if an athlete asked me to help them and I could help them, I would do my best to try to help them. And last year, an athlete named TJ Van Garderen, who's finished top 5 in the Tour de France twice, came to me and asked if I would help him. And you know, I was really like, oh, I don't want to get back on the Grand Tour stage. I don't know if I'm up for this. I don't know if I'm ready for this. And I said, hey, look, man, you're a pretty smart guy. Why don't you just do it yourself? You know, like, you know, like, what can I do? I mean, really, like, what can I do? And I said, you know, what do you need to be your best? And he thinks about it for a while, and he tells me this story. He says to me, well, you know, right before the Tour of California, I was in a really bad way. Earlier that spring, you know, my wife and my kids weren't happy in Spain. We were fighting a lot. They decided to move back to America. You know, it gutted me. I didn't know when I was going to see them again. And I wasn't expecting to see them for a while. But right before the start of the time trial of the Tour of California, he hears his little girl screaming for him from across the barriers. And he runs over to see her. It's the first time they've seen each other, you know, in almost 3 months. They came to surprise him. She starts crying. He starts crying. He gives her a hug and says, hey, I've got to do this race. I'll be right back. And he goes up to the start gate, the tears still rolling from his eyes. And he launches out of this thing like a bat out of hell. His power's way too high. He knows that he needs to bring down this wattage. Finally says to himself, screw it. I'm just going to let this thing fly. And he ends up decimating the field in that time trial, winning that time trial, getting the yellow jersey at the Tour of California. And then he looks at me and he says, you know, what I learned from that experience is that all I need to be my best is love, right? And at that point, he totally had me. So I'm like, all right, let's do this thing, right? Let's get out there and let's figure out how you can be the best in the world. Because I think that as human beings, despite the fact that my job is to bring sports science and technology to the game, to bring this quote-unquote marginal gain to the field of play, the reality is we're all just humans, right? And we need the support to be our best. To support riders in the past, what I've always done is I've always used a scooter to motor pace athletes. And the reason why we use a scooter is because we're trying to create the specificity of a moving peloton, right? And in a peloton, even though it might look really smooth and very fast, right, there are all of these little undulations, and there's a ton of skill involved. And so when you look at the pattern of power output of a pro cyclist in a pack or behind a scooter, what you see is not a constant or steady power output. You see all of these violent spikes. It's a big surge, and then it settles and floats, and then it's a big surge, and it settles and floats. And so the only way that you can specifically replicate the demands of pro tour riding is to do a lot of motor pacing, right? To sit behind a scooter for hours. And this is Taylor Finney here, and over his 10 or so year career, we calculated that we've done maybe about 20,000 miles of motor pacing together, right? So it's a huge amount. And for me, it's also really, really bad because after a season of motor pacing, I'm at least 15 pounds heavier. My back is sore. Like, I'm totally unfit, and my mind is just kind of melted. But here's the situation. The situation is that in the mountains, you have a very different scenario. And when you look at the race tactics in the Tour de France, you have a team like Ineos, right? The old Team Sky that is so strong, who can hire such incredible athletes that what they do in the mountains is they line it up and they just throttle it, right? And the complaint has been that it's boring racing, that you can't see these guys, nobody attacks, right? And that's just this one line of guys just cruising up a hill. It's because these guys are going so fast that nobody can attack, right? And there's still a significant draft effect, probably in the order of anywhere from 10 watts to about 25 watts that you're still saving up a steep grade because they're still going so fast up these hills, right? The issue is how do you prepare athletes for that today, right? When we try to take the scooter up these hills, the torque on these engines and the throttle sensitivity is too gross to be able to handle the very, very subtle speed changes, right, that occur on the mountains. More importantly, you need to be able to push athletes to a whole nother level if they're going to succeed against teams like Ineos, right? And one of the problems that we were having with TJ earlier in the year in January is we were here in Southern California, primarily training between the Santa Ynez Valley all the way through, San Diego, depending upon the rain and the weather, was that one, every time we tried to bring these scooters and pace him up these climbs, it wouldn't work. So the scooter is great for flat rolling terrain. Number two, anytime we tried to get riders to go out and train with him and spar with him and do intervals with him, they would all opt out, right? Because TJ's in this weird space where he's good enough that it's really, really hard for him to find good training partners, right, who can dedicate themselves to him getting better. But he's not strong enough that he is by himself competitive against a Team Sky or a Chris Froome, right, or a Geraint Thomas. And so we needed a way to give him training partners that never got tired, right? And I was following him one day in the car, and I was with my good friend, Chef Bijou Thomas, and I'm like, Bij, how are we going to do this? How are we going to find TJ this year an unlimited source of training partners, right, who will never get tired, who will take hit after hit after hit, and then hit back, and then knee him in the nuts, and just take this whole thing to a whole nother level. And that solution came in the form of ex-pro bike racer Tim Johnson on an e-bike, right? What we realized was that we need someone who had the skill of racing, who could handle himself in a peloton, who could handle all of the descents of the Pyrenees or the Alps, but who had a little bit of extra support so that they could keep on bringing it to TJ, right? And keep on just hurting him over and over and over again. And initially, we weren't sure if it was going to work, right? And we weren't sure, if it was going to feel right or if the whole thing was going to come together. But what was really amazing was that Tim, who does have a really great ride feel, was willing to try, right? And we started out in California and basically just started employing him as if he was someone that they were racing against. And, with these pedal assist systems now, they're so sensitive, and depending upon what mode you put them in, it worked out better than if we actually did have another training partner, right? It worked better than the scooter. It worked better than having a whole peloton. It was totally controlled, and it basically revolutionized all of the options that we had in preparing for the Tour de France. What was really interesting too is we initially started this with Tim because we weren't kind of confident or sure that anyone could do it, but I decided to hop on. And even though I was always kind of like maybe one notch higher in terms of battery usage than, say, Tim was or another pro was, it was totally feasible for me to ride most of the day with these guys and actually hurt them, which is one of the most, it's like people need to be paying to have this opportunity, right? This could be like a whole new market because, when we speak to the fun, it's so much fun, right? And at the end of the day, when I look at the power output that I do, right, I'm using a pair of power tap pedals to measure my power output. I'm doing more work. I'm working harder than I would be if I was riding a normal road bike by myself, right? Because now I've got someone to spar with, right? And I've got this kind of sense of competition. And so for the first time in my life, by actually employing e-bikes in training, I was actually getting more fit, because for the days that I was in the mountains, we could switch out and go to the e-bike, and for the days that we were on the flats, we could stick with the scooter. And so we were actually able to create the kind of specificity that TJ and the rest of the EF guys needed to prep themselves for the tour. I think that one of the limitations, of course, is descending, right? And the speed on the flats, right? And so, when you're in a place like Andorra, which is either up or down or up and down, Tim was really, really fighting and working super hard to keep up with them on the descents, but he was totally fine on the climbs, right? And so there was still a little bit of balance, a little bit of compromise. I think that, it's one of these situations, if we could just, throttle all the time, ungoverned, it would help. What ended up happening was that it started this culture amongst the EF team where we had a host of these Cannondale e-bikes. And if guys needed to get paced, if they needed to train really, really hard, what they started then doing was employing each other, right? And so this was a day about a week before the Tour de France where the guys needed to do a super, super hard day of training. Taylor Phinney had already opted out of the Tour de France. And so they called Taylor and they basically, hey, will you ride the e-bike today so that it's extra challenging? And he was like, yeah, absolutely, this would be fantastic. And so all day long, Taylor was on the e-bike pacing these guys and running different race scenarios. And for Taylor, who is a seasoned pro, the epiphany in his brain was staggering. I mean, he was coming constantly back to the car and being like, Al, I've never gone this fast up hills in my entire life. I've never heard these guys breathing as hard as I'm hearing them breathing. He's like, for the first time in my pro career, I know what it's like to be in the front group of a hill climb. He's like, I'm usually in the gruppetto. I'm usually like way off the back. We're just struggling and fighting. And he's like, these guys are impressive athletes. Like, they're really good. And so for him, it was like this whole new experience. And at one point, he comes back to the car and he's like, ow. He's like, I'm freaking out. And I'm like, what's going on? He's like, I feel really guilty right now. Like, I feel like I am like hurting these guys, and I've never been in this position where I've hurt them this bad. And he's like, I don't know how to deal with this. And I'm like, well, then fake it, man. Like, pretend like you're going hard. And so he goes back up to them, and they're throttling on this climb called Roca Corba. And I'm kind of close enough, and Taylor is like fake breathing hard. And I realized like he's almost kind of like fake orgasming. It's just this really weird thing that's happening with these guys because he's wanting to like encourage them and push them and make it seem like he's not working hard, but he's still, challenging them. It was a super fun and bizarre and weird dynamic. And what was really cool was after this experience, Taylor ended up taking this Cannondale and he basically rode and trained on it for the rest of the summer. And his primary reasoning for that was that it allowed him to go places in Europe that he's never been able to go to before. And it didn't change the intensity that he rode. It didn't change the total amount of work he did. But for him, he's such an explorer. He was like, I got to see 3 times the number of things and explore 10 times the number of roads than I normally would have been able to if I was by myself on my road bike. Right? And so even for a professional cyclist, this opened up a huge new window of opportunity while not taking away from his personal fitness, right? Pretty cool experience. On the harder days, we would have to change out the battery. And so typically, to give you some metrics, a 6-hour day with about 10 to 12,000 feet of climbing, with the athletes themselves doing about 5,000 kilojoules worth of work. So that's almost 1,000 kilojoules an hour. This is hard work. A guy like Tim would probably have to change out the battery twice. And a guy like myself, I'd probably have to change out the battery 2 or 3 times, right? And so We would always carry spare charged batteries. We were lucky enough that we had a follow car, but Zach Krapfel is actually building me a new bicycle today where we can just mount on on the bicycle a spare battery and be good for almost any situation without a follow vehicle. And I think as we progress this next year, we'll start carrying, panniers with supplies, water bottles, extra clothing, etc. And this will be our single vehicle. What's really cool is that it reduces our carbon footprint of training, right? It improves my fitness and my ability to be out there on the road. There's not all this fumage coming up and hitting the riders. And what's really cool as a trainer is that it's so quiet when you're on these bicycles training with these guys that you can hear everything. And you can hear their breathing. You can hear those intensity changes. And they can talk and have a conversation with you. And you can practice these very, very specific race scenarios. So we did a little video. There's some bunch of video on YouTube. If you type in e-bike training, Velo News, or Beyond Limits, which is the show that I do with them, some pretty interesting insight there as well. And we'll continue to see how this evolves. But my guess is that as teams start the next season, I don't think there will be a single World Tour team that isn't also employing a fleet of e-bicycles so that they can train their athletes, right? This is going to become standard practice. And I think it's a great evolution in terms of how to train pro cyclists. You basically have, quote unquote, robot training partners who never get tired, right? But what's cool is this technology, especially in terms of the intimacy of training, being able to hear them, the connection that you have, being able to experience the road with them. It brings a whole nother level of intimacy to the training process, which is ultimately, why we do this.